Good morning, everyone. My name is Harry Chapman, and I'm the Content Director for DTX. Thanks very much for joining us for our fourth in the series of our DTX Talks. We're going to be focusing on creating the workplace of the future today. Something that is a very important topic. It's been in the news recently with the CEO of Barclays saying he's not sure he can see a time where there'll be 6,000 people in a building again. And something that 70% of our audience has highlighted as probably the number one digital transformation issue for 2020. I'm really lucky to be joined by an expert on this subject today, Ismail Amla, who's Chief Growth Officer at Capita. Ismail, thanks very much for joining us.
Great to be here, Harry. Good morning.
And happy birthday. Thanks for joining us on your birthday.
Thank you very much. As you can see, I'm on the beach here. Oh, I wish I was. I'm in Bolton, really.
Sunny Bolton.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
To kick things off, I wanted to ask you a question about your work. What's the number one thing that you miss about working in the office, and what's the one thing you really love about remote working?
Great question, right? I think the obvious thing that I miss about being in the office is actually not to do with the work. It's all the banter, it's the social interaction, it's hanging around with people just because you're there with them. So I think I miss the social aspect of work, of a social aspect of not being in the office. I think what I do not miss is the commute. I live in Lancashire. Work mostly in London, so the Manchester Piccadilly Euston train gets a lot of traction from me, so I don't really miss that.
Yeah, that is a long commute, a very tough one.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to pass over to you, Ismail, for the 15 minutes of talk, and ladies and gents, while you're listening, please do fire questions through. We'll pick those up as we come to the end. Please do ask anything and I'll put them together, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we possibly can. So Ismail, over to you.
Thank you very much, Harry. And we're going to use a few slides just to sort of make sure we keep on track. And really this is to engage everybody in a bit of a discussion rather than just present what I think is the right answer, because I think we're all part of this big experiment that we're going through right now. So greetings to everybody, wherever you're dialing in from. It's a great subject, of course, what is the future of the workspace? And of course, it's the right question, especially when we hear people like Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey announce the company would allow its employees who are currently working from home because of COVID to stay at home for good. So they don't really see the office as it used to be. Facebook have plans to follow suit with plans to keep more people at home. Google, you might have seen, announced last week that they don't want anybody in the office, or they don't mandate anybody to come into the office till the middle of next year. So, there is a question, will the office be a casualty of the pandemic? It's an important question, but it's not a new question. So in the 60s, American futurist Malvin Weber, who was working at a lot of stuff at Berkeley, basically around the future of cities, he predicted that we would reach the post-city age, and he said it might be possible to locate on a mountaintop and stay connected in a real-time way with fellow colleagues. We'll come back to that. That was in the 1960s. Then, as soon as the dot-com boom, and a number of us remember that very well, one journalist said the internet would mean the end of distance. And once distance doesn't matter, the logic goes, the office becomes irrelevant. So the office has been under discussion for some time, the workspace has been under discussion, but clearly the COVID experience has brought it all to a head. Before we jump to any conclusion, though, I'd say let's have a quick think about what's actually happened, what the macro trends are that we might want to think about, and then what the role of the office might be. So the first thing to think about, I think the first way to think about this really is that this is a massive experiment that we've all been part of over the last few months. One that has largely proved that remote ways of working can work. Well, of course it works, you think. It's always worked. Well, I mean, how did that prove that? Well, think about this. Last year, just 5.1% of adults in employment in the UK primarily work from home. 5.1%. About 12% spent some time working from home. Now, that 5.1% last year was compared to 4.3% in 2015. Now, that's actually quite profound. Despite all of this push, this technology, this idea that we're all going to be working wherever we want to be working, there was only a change from 4.3 to 5% in a 5-year time frame. Roll forward quickly to April, middle of the COVID crisis, 49.2% of employment, of adults in employment are working from home in the UK. Still early in the experiment, but clearly you can see massive change. We've crossed the chasm. Working from home works because it has to work. So what have we learned in that period? Well, it's easier to see how flexible working hours might work. So the idea that I'm going to look after kids, I'm going to be online during this time, that's when I'm going to take my meetings. When we were in the office, that was more difficult to get our head around, to put it into practice. Now everybody's doing it. It's something that we think is, of course, business as usual. We've learned that we might need to manage by output rather than presenteeism. Is somebody in the office? Do they get in at 9 o'clock? Doesn't really matter. Are they producing what they said they were going to produce? Doesn't matter. So we've learned maybe our management style has to change a little bit. We've learned actually there is an issue of physical and mental health, potentially, because of isolation. We've also learned actually that jobs that we thought necessitated a shared workplace are being performed from home during the pandemic. And yet anybody, all of us who've been on these Zoom calls know that despite advances in communication tech, engaging with colleagues remotely often remains far more difficult than face-to-face. So Zoom fatigue is something that's very, very real. Now, does all of this mean that the office is irrelevant? If you think about the next slide, I'm on the workplace as adapted here, Harry. I'm not sure if the workplace is irrelevant, but we do know the workplace is adapted and is now very different. And we know it's totally dependent on technology. Again, if you think about the technology, let's take Microsoft Teams as an example. They have gone from 32 million users in March of this year to 75 million users in April. They doubled in 1 month of this year. So technology, people were saying, you know, some people were using it, some people were using it partly. Everybody has to use it. It works. Everybody's way in there. The market itself, of course, has gone hugely. Actually, is expected to grow from 8 billion in 2019 to 23 billion in 2020. So huge market, huge opportunity that this has generated. And a really interesting stat that I saw, which was Zoom, which is the platform we're on now, right now. They made last year a profit of nearly $200,000. In the first quarter of this year, they made a profit of $27 million. So this has changed for technology providers who are in this space. This has changed the world as they knew it. But the office, physical office has changed as well. That has already also has to adapt. So those people who do have to go in, and of course there's still people going into the office, because of social distancing, the capacity has changed, and cleaning regimes has changed. And most organizations have had to think about what does it look like for a hybrid workforce, where some people work from home, some people work in the office. That has started to also drive strategy change. So businesses like Shopify, who some of you may have come across, their CEO tweeted that the office centricity is over. We will keep our offices closed until the end of 2021. We're going to redo our strategy to make sure that's how it works. As I've already said, Twitter and Square have said people can work from home forever, and other organizations have started to take account of the fact that the office is going to be very different. So if the office is going to go away, what impact does it have on productivity? So the jury is still out on productivity. If you look at some of the empirical studies, A 2012 Stanford study said that remote working may increase productivity, and this will be because people are taking shorter breaks, they're less distracted, they're less commuting. They also said that people stayed with the company longer and reported higher level of happiness. In 2016, there was another study which looked at the Fortune 500 companies, and they said they experienced higher levels of job satisfaction. So that's historical studies. If you look at the current COVID period, there isn't any data which says whether productivity increases or decreases. There is some data from the Office of National Statistics which says labour productivity fell from January to March, but that is potentially because of the furlough scheme where people were still considered as employed but not working. So the specific empirical data is not available. Anecdotally, global business leaders are saying flexible working has a positive impact. We've had studies of companies where CEOs are saying that they're seeing a positive impact on productivity. So there's jury out, different sorts of data, nothing specific. The reality is that there is something going on here which is potentially bigger than just COVID, bigger than remote working, and bigger than technology. So let's take a quick step back as to what else is going on here. I think if you think about the workspace, there's some key questions that we might want to think about. If there is no office, no workspace, and we aren't able to meet and just have casual conversations, what are we losing? Are we missing out on ideas and inspirations that comes from having a chance encounter over a coffee or a meeting that you hadn't scheduled, you know, the water cooler chat that we always talk about? What role has the office played in people's lives beyond just being a place to work? Are we overlooking the social benefits of the office? What is the economic impact of having an office and all the infrastructure around it? And there's something actually that, that really resonated with me that was framed really well by the sociologist Mark Granovetter. And what he said was that functioning societies are not underpinned just by strong ties, i.e. close relationships, but also weak ties, casual acquaintances, where strong ties tend to form dense overlapping networks. Close friends are often close friends with others. Weak ties actually connect us to a larger, more diverse group of people. And the weak ties, i.e. people that we don't plan to meet, are more likely to connect us with new ideas and perspectives. I mean, this is generally the view around diversity anyway. And, you know, this allows us to connect us with people outside of our circles, you know, fellow train passengers, colleagues we don't work with directly. And so there is some negative impact potentially of a workspace where potentially we may lose out on the opportunity for new ideas. I'm very conscious of time here, so I'm going to very quickly shift through some of the other data pieces I want to put on the table before we have a discussion. There's some of the macro things I think we need to be conscious of. Three things that I will touch on very quickly. Changing demographics. People are living longer. If people are living longer and working longer, how do we accommodate a workplace that meets the need of an 18-year-old and also the need of an 80-year-old? The gig economy. There's different types of people doing different types of work. So people are looking for projects rather than careers. We know that there are more than 300,000 self-employed people who do more than two jobs, two knowledge worker jobs. So if you see all of that, how does a workspace accommodate the flexibility where the requirements are going to be very different from a 9-to-5 office worker? When you think about flexible workspace, you think about WeWorks, right? Everybody knows about the story about WeWork. They were valued at 47 billion. The challenge went from 47 billion with all the financial issues that they had. The valuation plummeted more than 70%. But the real challenge for organizations like WeWork is how do you compete with free, i.e. people working from home or for coffee shops? So the flexible workspace also is going to have an impact on what the workspace might look like. There's another big thing we need to think about, which is the environment. So we quickly forget that actually just before COVID started, the Earth was pretty much on fire. And the European Space Agency reported that there were 5 times as many fires in August 29 versus a year ago. If you think back, the teenage climate activist Greta Thunberg was chosen as Times Person of the Year. This is not that long ago. We've forgotten because of COVID. And it's perhaps little wonder that the environmental issues dominated leaders' concern for the future prior to COVID. Of course, this opportunity gives us a huge opportunity to impact the environment, because travel is the biggest impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Do we use it to mandate new policies? So not only are we going to react to what's going on and create a workspace of the future, but we're going to actively design what the workspace of the future is going to be, because we're going to stop people traveling by policy, because we know we can, because the world continues to function. And then, as a result of that, this does ask the question, what does that mean for cities? There's a lot of questions being raised as a result of what the impact COVID has had on cities. I mean, 1 or 2 examples. Large areas of London are going to be made car-free as the lockdown is eased. Streets will be reserved for pedestrians, cyclists and buses. And as Sadiq Khan said, to repurpose London streets for people. It will be the largest car-free zone of any capital in the world. Milan are going to transform 35 kilometers of streets over the summer. And so that they're not going to reopen up temporary cycle lanes that were opened up during letdowns. What does that mean for office and headquarters? What does that mean for individuals who want to live closer to people they work with, so that they can meet in the coffee shop or go around for a walk in the park, not necessarily go into the office? Does that mean there will be a campus type effect around businesses and business ecosystems? So as we can see, there's going to be a profound impact, actually, not just on the city, not just on the office, but all of the things affecting the office. And we start to get to a couple of minutes, and I'll close so we can have time for questions. We start to get to a really interesting place, which is around what the longer term impact might be of the office space. So if you think about remote working has to address different constituents of the workforce, multi-generational, parents, people living on their own. It also needs to have, the office space needs to have technology innovation. So you've got fully touchless or low touch or voice enabled technology. You've got well-being and wellness checks as part of going into the office. You've got remote collaboration tools that we're on now, for an example. You've got autonomous cleaning solutions. And what we then end up with is an environment where potentially we're going to retire the multi-year trend towards open plan layouts to have meeting rooms and booths just for video conferencing. So there's going to be some reversal in the physical office space. We're going to use unused desk space as collaboration areas or well-being areas to support innovation or mental health agendas. We're going to use Internet of Things and smart building technology to optimize where people are, how they should be working, and all the lighting and temperatures to suit very individual working patterns. As we look not that far ahead, we may well have a digital avatar of ourselves to attend an office that exists almost entirely in virtual reality. And that could become a commonplace. We know it's very likely to. We know Apple are investing very hugely in that. And Zoom themselves are looking to transform video conferencing from 2D to 3D, and then augmented reality. So imagine having a meeting, this meeting, where we can smell the coffee being drunk by others around the table 100 miles away, or greeting a close colleague with a hug and actually being able to feel it. So clearly technology is going to have a huge part in what the future office space might look like. So to close and bring us back to the question, I think the question about what does the office space look like actually springs a whole set of questions. And actually not only on a personal level or a business level, but all on a society level as to what the role of the office is and what it means in terms of the ecosystem in which we live. And perhaps what the COVID crisis has shown is that we have the tools to stay connected from anywhere, from the mountain table or our kitchen table for that matter. Our challenge today is to leverage the physical space so that we may regularly descend from our isolated summits, and that the physical space or the rebirth of the office becomes something that nurtures the ties that bind us all together. And this will drive change not just in the office, but in organizational strategies, in city strategies, individual life decisions. And perhaps the biggest change of all, I think, is in the fourth industrial revolution, we talked about many different types of workers: the gig worker, the knowledge worker, the corporate worker, the tech-dependent worker, the remote worker. And perhaps what we're seeing is the birth of a new type of worker, forced upon us by what happened around COVID and the acceleration of technology. Harry, I know I've gone over here by a good 5 minutes, so I'll stop there and perhaps we can ask some questions.
That's fine, Ismail. That's really insightful. Thanks. I think we've got a lot of questions coming through from our audience. One just from me before we get into those. You talked about kind of different environments and people working in the office. Do you think the one thing certain that companies will reduce their office real estate though? Do you think we'll see less floor space? And what do you think that means? We're going to have more technology in the home? I'm thinking as an IT professional, tech professional, there's going to be less need for networks perhaps in the office. I'm going to have to invest in more technology in the home, like Google have given budgets to their employees for that.
Yeah. I think that seems to be one inevitable conclusion, that the office space, which is committed to individual companies, will absolutely go down. It feels like that. But I think what we aren't thinking about is the collaboration space in a WeWork type of environment where people can ad hoc go and use the space. That will potentially go up. And maybe there's a role for governments or local councils to provide that sort of space, so that the small, medium enterprises or the individual contributor who wouldn't normally have that sort of relationship with a WeWork or that sort of organization still has the ability to go and work somewhere collaboratively as needed, which isn't in the coffee house. Now, there's another school of thought here, Harry, which says that maybe the coffee space changes. And they become, they become, if you remember the time when retail banks created coffee spaces and they become these multifunctional environments, maybe that might happen as well. But clearly there's obvious, it looks like it's obvious that there's going to be an impact on office space, yeah.
Well, cool. We've got one question here from Hamid Farouk. He's also kind of asking on that subject, what do you think the effect will be on working conditions, on kind of day-to-day lives of people, and what will the health and safety impacts be? For example, obviously with people working at home, there's repetitive injury, strain, stress, awkward positions. We talked about earlier, it's very hard to see an end to the working day. There's a big health and well-being conversation here.
There is, and it drives, I think, big change in policies around physical and mental health, in responsibilities that an organization has, which extend beyond their physical buildings, and a responsibility to provide appropriate kit, if you like, if you're expecting people to work from home. I think the provision of kit is an easier thing to do than ensuring that physical and mental health is protected. And I think that is maybe work in progress in terms of how that might look like. But I think Amit's question is the right one. It is something that we are working out in terms of how do we mitigate the risks around that as we go into this new journey.
And I guess a further question on the state of the workforce here from Bipin Patel. What impact do you think this is all going to have on the diversity landscape? And and to add to that from me, what impact do you think it will have on the skills landscape? Because if you've got some more remote workers, obviously there's a wider pool for employees to access.
Yeah. So if I start with the skills landscape, there was Peter Diamandis talked about this a couple of years ago when he said that 2,000 people are going to come online on the internet, and they're going to be in remote parts of the world, and they're going to have access to all of the knowledge we have access to through Google, all of the purchases we can access through Amazon, all of the money we have access to through crowdfunding and so on and so forth, well, this becomes a reality in that 2 billion people across the world are now part of our potential workforce. So from an employer perspective, the employee base gets bigger because we know we can work remotely. From an employee perspective, we've got to understand we've got competition sitting miles away that we didn't have before. So I think that is absolutely a reality that we were beginning to see, and I think we're going to see that. From a diversity perspective, I'm actually quite hopeful that from a diversity perspective, this will help give access to different demographics who would not otherwise see themselves working in a particular job in a particular way. So if you think about working mums who have particular hours that they used to be able to work, which precluded them from some jobs because of commuting or child pickup and so on, I think suddenly, this has become more acceptable. Technology allows us to work in this way. So I am hopeful that actually from a diversity perspective, this is going to be a positive thing.
Good. That's good to hear. So no fears for all of us then. do we think, it's a question here from James McGough. Do we think that millennials and Gen X may have changed their mind about working from home during lockdown? I guess going back to your point, there's these water cooler interactions for those young people coming in and learning at the start of their careers. It's quite important. Perhaps the senior management, though, is really enjoying remote working and doesn't want to go back to the office.
I think there's a couple of things if you think about the millennials and people just coming out of university. A lot of them are in environments where it's not easy for them to work from home. They might have a flat share. They might only have the working environment in their room. They might not have the ability, to get the sort of comfort from home that some of us might get. So there is what facilities do you have at home to work on? And I think that's one thing to consider. The learning and the social interaction is absolutely something that I think needs to be addressed. I think a lot of it will be addressed with some of this 3D and AR technology in terms of giving a better ability to engage with people. In some ways, because of the way that we think and we want to interact and we want to communicate with somebody, this technology allows us to do it in a real-time manner. So I don't have to book a meeting with my mentor 3 months down the road because that's the only time you've got available. It may be that, through chat or through this sort of mechanism, I can get better access to my mentor. But I don't think it is enough. I think it's good, but I don't think it's enough. I think the need to physically get together, to spend time, to socialize, to learn on the job effectively, is going to be something that we're going to have to address and have to come to terms with, because I'm not sure that remotely you can coach or mentor somebody as good as you could with a mixture, with a hybrid approach.
There really is no substitute to face-to-face, is there, at the end of the day, for body language and interaction. Just grouping, for a final question, just grouping a couple of points together from Abdul Munim and Christopher Bassin. How do you think people are going to differentiate between the working week? We talked about this earlier, obviously kind of running into the evenings and things, and the non-working weekend. Will we need to? Will we want to? Does this kind of pave the way perhaps for a new type of employment contract, perhaps?
Yeah, and we sort of touched on that. I think there's a couple of things here, and I'm experiencing it myself. I feel my productivity is up. I think you should ask my boss whether it is or not. But I also feel exhausted at the end of the week, and all I've done is sat on this chair. And I have a commute of 30 seconds. And I think there's a little bit of personal discipline. So I've got to the idea of at a particular time I am closing up shop and I'm going for a run regardless of what happens. I may come back later on in the evening, but I think that there is a personal discipline. But also from an employer perspective, I think this idea of managing by output becomes really important, which means another approach to employee engagement, another approach to leadership, and another approach to managing progress. And both of those things, I think, will need to happen to be able for us to find an equilibrium of working at home where we can still create boundaries between home and switching off and work and just focusing on that.
a challenge, isn't it? And I think if you've got a smaller space and you might be working in your bedroom, it can be hard to sleep in those scenarios, perhaps for some people, or close the door to work. But thanks, Ismail. We've had a lot of questions. Hopefully, we've answered as many of those as we can. To those of you who are listening, the recording will be available afterwards. So do look out for that. We'll be sending it around. I want to thank Ismail and to all of you for joining here today with us. Our next one of these is taking place on the 19th of August. That's with Gavin Barton. He's a CTO of Booking.com Transport, and he'll be looking at the importance of agility in the tech landscape. So Ismail, thanks very much for joining us today, and thanks everyone for listening. Goodbye.
Thanks.